Hey guys, Cam here from PhoneDog.com, and it's Thursday, which means normally at this point I will be looking back at a particular phone from the past, one of the greatest smartphones of all time, or one of the greatest general phones of all time, and that was my intention today. I was going to review what I thought was the Nokia 8310. Then when I took the battery out and I realised actually this is a 6510 with an 8310 cover on it, which amazingly works quite well, and both phones were quite similar. But what I'm going to do instead is I am going to get hold of a proper 6510 case, put it on this phone, and I'll review it for you at another time. But today instead I wanted to go through some of my favourite phones from the past, since I still wanted to look back but maybe give you something a little bit different to watch. These top 5 phones are all phones that I have owned and used. It might not necessarily be that they had the best specs or performance of the time, but they were phones that I owned and loved and struggled to get rid of. And that could be for many different reasons, but mostly it's because I formed some sort of weird emotional attachment with the device. Number 5 in my list is the Sony Ericsson W880i. It was the third candy bar formed phone in the Walkman series, and it was just fantastic. It was ridiculously thin, it had a metal plate on the front, some really cool pill-shaped buttons, they were easy to press, and it was really thin and small, and I think that's what I really liked about it. It was so tiny, it was easy to hold in one hand and use, and what's great was that it came with a huge memory card, or what was huge at the time. You could pack it full of music, and it came with rather good earphones. You barely could tell it was in your pocket, and it had this really neat feature where the battery wasn't quite the right size to fit in the back, so if you knocked it a little bit too hard, the phone would reboot. That wasn't really a feature now that I think about it. But still didn't stop me from loving the phone any less. I use it as my daily driver for quite a few months. And if you know me, which you don't know me that well, but if a phone lasts more than 3 or 4 months as my daily driver, it's generally a very good phone. Number 4 on my list is what I thought this was. The 8310 by Nokia had a white backlight, a tiny screen, tiny buttons, easy to use, very light. And it had some cool games on there which you could play. But it had sort of an emotional, historical attachment for me, because the 8310 was the phone I was using when I was dating the woman who then became my wife. And so it's always going to be one of those phones I will never forget, because I'll look back at that time, 9-10 years ago now, and I'll realise, yeah, I had a Nokia 8310 at that point. We both had one, and it was awesome. You could change the covers on it, change the battery out, but that's only if you needed to. The battery would last about a week or a week and a half. Those were the days when you could actually forget that your phone even needed charging, because it used to go on for that long. But I think what I liked about it most was that, unlike most other Nokias at the time, it did have this white backlight on it. And it looked really clean and polished, and if you ever ruined the outside of the phone, you could just buy a new case and stick it on, and it looked like a brand new phone. Number 3 on my list, and a lot more recent, was the T-Mobile G1. That's right, the first Android phone. And it was my first of the modern era of smartphones, if you can put it that way. Everything I'd had before then was a Windows Mobile, a Sony Ericsson, or a BlackBerry, and so the user interface was something at the time that kind of made you go, whoa. And it had widgets that you could kind of float around the screen. You would scroll through the home pages and watch your wallpaper go in the background. And it had a screen that kind of flicked around, and that was really cool, and it had a great keyboard. It was just one of those amazing devices that came out at a time where I was starting to get really interested in them. And that's right. Although I used to be the managing editor of an iPhone blog, I had Android first. There's a shocker. Number 2 on my list is a BlackBerry. The Pearl 8110 was the second generation of Pearl devices, but the first one that I had owned myself and used as a daily driver. It was brilliant, and it's still one of those phones that I look back on now and I think, I wish I still had that, because it had so many things that really kind of clicked with me. It didn't have a great camera, but with the battery life that I could get it to last about a week. Oh, sometimes more than a week, and this was a smartphone. I would use it for sending emails, texts, and I loved the QWERTY keypad on it, or what they called at the time a Sure-type keyboard, or what they call now a compressed QWERTY. It would have 2 letters on each button. It was so fast to type on, it was so light, it was so small, the battery lasted for ages. And I think the 8110 was the one that had GPS, so you could use it for satellite navigation as well. And everything, it just boggled my mind that you could do all this stuff with such a small and light device. And the reason this is in number 2 is because it was, like I said, it was one of those phones that just clicked with the way that I wanted to use a phone. It just suited me right down to the ground at that point in time. It was my daily driver and my only phone for a solid 9 to 10 months, and that is unheard of for me. Except for when I get to my number 1 phone. Probably no surprise that it's an iPhone, but perhaps a surprise which iPhone it is. It's the 3GS, the phone that came out in 2009. I actually went out and bought this phone 4 days after my eldest daughter was born. But that's not why I love this phone, although I remember quite clearly sitting in the shop buying an iPhone for the first time with a buggy and a tiny baby sat in there. The iPhone 3GS was fantastic. I'd just been using the G1 for about 6 months. I switched to the iPhone with the 3GS, and I think it was the way that it looked with the white shell on the back. Of course, I had the white one, and it felt amazing in hand. The user experience was so fast and fluid. Everything seemed so easy. And I owned it for 12 months without using a single other device in that time. I just didn't want to. I wasn't interested. I loved that iPhone. And I remember when the iPhone 4 came out, and because I was working on an iPhone blog, I had to kind of sell this 3GS that I loved so much and buy an iPhone 4, which was square and glass and cold and flat and horrible. And even though it was technically a much better phone, the 3GS was one of those phones that I kind of missed for a long time after I sold it, and sometimes still do. It's ridiculous. It's a piece of plastic with a screen on it, and I still look back at my iPhone 3GS and wish that I still had it. And that's why it is my first and most favourite phone of all time. May not make sense to you, but there we go. There are some other honorary mentions as well. Tons of Nokia phones that I've owned and loved, like the 6300. I had the 6822 with a QWERTY keyboard that kind of folded out. That was awesome. I also had the 8800, which was more of the premium sort of lineup, but the Sony Ericsson lineup was awesome at the time as well. Years ago, I had the K800, which had an amazing camera. And of course, a BlackBerry Bold 9780, which I had a few years ago as well. That was one of my favourite phones, but I had to try and narrow it down to 5, and so I did. Now I want to know from you, what are your favourite devices of all time? Not necessarily because they've got great specs or even had great specs at the time. Which phones did you love using the most as your daily driver? And how long did you use them for? Let me know in the comments or tweet me. I'm at phonedog_cam. I will see you again soon. And just in case you're interested, if you wanted to see all the phones I have ever owned, I have made a list on Pinterest. Because I'm that sad.